Retired Master Sergeant Bob Sullivan sits quietly in the corner booth of O'Connor's Café, reading his newspaper over black coffee when the leather-clad biker towers over him and snarls, "Move it, old man! This is my table," before delivering a sharp slap across Bob's weathered cheek that echoes through the suddenly silent restaurant. Bob Sullivan had celebrated his 69th birthday 4 weeks ago, but he still carried himself with the straight back and steady gait of a career soldier. Every Tuesday morning for the past 6 years, he'd claimed the same corner booth at O'Connor's Café on Oak Street. The cafe was a local institution, family-owned for 3 generations. Bob's own photo from his deployment to Afghanistan hung near the coffee station, though most people didn't make the connection between the young sergeant in desert camouflage and the quiet older man who read his paper in the corner. Bob had enlisted right out of high school in 1974, 3 months after his 18th birthday. He'd served in places most people couldn't pronounce, from Germany during the Cold War to the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan. 30 years of service had taken him from a scared kid from Pennsylvania to a master sergeant responsible for training young soldiers who reminded him of his own son. His boy David had followed in his footsteps, graduating from West Point and serving as an Army captain. Bob was prouder of David than any medal or commendation he'd ever received. The kid had grown up hearing bedtime stories about honor and duty instead of fairy tales, and he'd turned into the kind of officer Bob would have been honored to serve under. But the wars had changed both father and son. Bob came home from his final deployment with a Bronze Star and a slight limp from shrapnel that would ache on rainy days. David came home from his tours carrying invisible wounds that were harder to heal. The nightmares, the jumpiness, the way he'd scan every room for exits the moment he walked in. 3 years ago, David had moved back to their hometown to be closer to his father. He'd taken a job at the regional Army recruiting station, helping other young people find their path to service. Bob was grateful for the company and proud of how his son had found a way to keep serving even after his combat days were over. The trouble started when Rick Steel Patterson roared into O'Connor's parking lot on his Harley-Davidson at exactly 9:45 a.m., the same time Bob was settling into his usual Tuesday morning routine. Steel was the president of the Devil's Riders Motorcycle Club, a group that had been causing problems around town for the better part of 7 months. But what they didn't realize about this quiet 69-year-old would change everything in that cafe. The Devil's Riders weren't your typical weekend riders. They dealt in intimidation and small-time crime, using their leather jackets and loud bikes to claim territory wherever they went. Steel stood 6'3", tall and weighed nearly 280 pounds, with arms covered in tattoos that told stories of bar fights and prison time. He'd been coming to O'Connor's for 4 weeks now, each time demanding the corner booth where Bob always sat. The first week, Bob had quietly moved to another table without complaint. The second week, he'd done the same thing. The third week, Bob had politely asked if Steel could find another spot, but had still moved when threatened. But this morning was different. This morning, Bob had decided he was tired of running. When Steel approached the booth with his usual swagger, Bob looked up from his newspaper but didn't move. He politely explained that he'd been sitting in this same spot every Tuesday for 6 years, and he'd appreciate it if Steel could find another table. Steel's face turned red with anger. He wasn't used to being told no, especially not by some old man in a cafe. His voice rose loud enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear as he called Bob names that made the waitresses look away in embarrassment. The other customers stopped eating and stared. A young mother quickly ushered her children toward the exit. Mrs. O'Connor, the owner, looked terrified but afraid to intervene. Steel had made it clear in previous visits that he didn't appreciate interference from management. When Bob calmly refused to move again, Steel's anger exploded into action. The slap came fast and hard, catching Bob across his left cheek with enough force to knock his reading glasses to the floor. The sound echoed through the cafe like a gunshot, followed by absolute silence. Bob's cheek burned from the impact, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation that followed. He could feel every eye in the cafe watching him, waiting to see how the old man would respond to being publicly shamed. For a moment, Bob was transported back to his childhood, remembering his father's words about standing up to bullies. Then he thought about his military training, about all the young soldiers he'd mentored over the years, about the values he'd tried to instill in his own son. He thought about the bronze star pin on his jacket and what it represented. But mostly he thought about David and how disappointed his son would be if he learned that his father had been humiliated in public and done nothing about it. Bob slowly reached down and picked up his glasses, checking them for damage before putting them back on. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He looked up at Steel with calm, measured eyes that had seen combat in 3 different wars. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any threat could have. What came next would prove that appearances can be the most dangerous deception. Bob simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and made a call. Steel laughed when he saw Bob reach for his phone. He assumed the old man was calling the police, and that didn't worry him. The Devil's Riders had dealt with small-town cops before. A few threats, maybe some property damage, and most local law enforcement learned to look the other way. What Steel didn't know was that Bob wasn't calling the police. He was calling his son. The conversation was brief and quiet. Bob simply said he was at O'Connor's Café and that he needed David to come by when he had a chance. He didn't mention the slap or the confrontation. He didn't need to. David could hear something in his father's voice that told him this wasn't a casual request. After Bob hung up, Steel made himself comfortable in the booth, spreading his leather jacket across the seat and ordering the most expensive item on the menu. He made crude comments to the waitresses and spoke loudly about how some people needed to learn respect for their betters. Bob moved to a small table near the window where he could watch the parking lot. He ordered another cup of coffee and waited. His cheek still stung, and he could see the concerned looks from other customers, but he remained calm and patient. Steele's confidence grew with each passing minute. He told his story to anyone who would listen, embellishing the details about how he'd taught some old fool a lesson about respect. He bragged about his motorcycle club and made veiled threats about what happened to people who didn't show proper appreciation for the Devil's Riders. The cafe's atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Several customers paid their bills quickly and left. Mrs. O'Connor hovered nervously near the kitchen, unsure whether to call the police herself. The remaining patrons ate in silence, afraid to draw Steele's attention. Bob checked his watch. David would be here soon. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan as an infantry officer and now worked as a recruiter. More importantly, he'd inherited his father's sense of justice and his unwillingness to let bullies win. But Bob had one more surprise that even David didn't know about yet. 12 minutes after Bob made his phone call, a convoy of military vehicles pulled into O'Connor's parking lot. Not just David's personal truck, but 3 official Army vehicles filled with soldiers in full-dress uniform. David Sullivan stepped out of the lead vehicle, now wearing the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel. The promotion had come through just last week, but he hadn't had a chance to tell his father yet. He'd been planning to surprise Bob with the news over lunch. Behind David came 12 soldiers from the regional recruiting station, all of them veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, all of them personally recruited and trained by Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan. They'd been in the middle of a formal ceremony when David got his father's call, and they'd insisted on coming along when they heard the careful tone in his voice. That's when the convoy of military vehicles pulled into O'Connor's parking lot. The soldiers formed up in the parking lot with military precision, their dress uniforms and polished boots creating an impressive display. David walked point, his expression serious but controlled as he approached the cafe entrance. Steel looked up from his meal as the restaurant filled with soldiers. His cocky expression faltered as he realized he was suddenly outnumbered 12-1. These weren't local cops or weekend warriors. These were active-duty Army personnel, and they moved with the confidence of people who'd seen real combat. David approached his father's table first, noting the red mark on Bob's cheek. He asked quietly if his father was all right, and Bob nodded toward Steele's booth. David's eyes followed his father's gaze, and his jaw tightened when he saw the biker still sprawled arrogantly across the seat. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan turned to face Steele with the bearing of an officer accustomed to command. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. He simply introduced himself and asked Steele to step outside for a conversation. Steele realized that his intimidation tactics weren't going to work against trained soldiers. These men had faced real enemies in real wars, not bar fights and parking lot confrontations. When a lieutenant colonel with 12 combat veterans asks you to step outside, you step outside. The conversation in the parking lot lasted exactly 8 minutes. Through the cafe window, everyone could see David speaking calmly but firmly, while the 12 soldiers stood at attention behind him. Steele's body language changed dramatically during those 8 minutes, going from defiant to defensive to completely defeated. Steele emerged looking pale and shaken, his earlier bravado completely gone. He approached Bob's table with his head down and offered a stammering apology for his behavior. Bob accepted the apology with quiet dignity, but he made it clear that Steele needed to understand something important. Bob explained that he'd served his country for 30 years, that he'd earned the right to drink his coffee in peace, and that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. Steele promised that neither he nor any of the Devil's Riders would bother Bob or anyone else at O'Connor's Café again. He left a $50 bill on the table to pay for Bob's coffee and quickly headed for the exit. But the real revelation was yet to come. As David removed his military cap and sat down across from his father, Mrs. O'Connor finally made the connection. The young sergeant in the Afghanistan photo on her wall, the one she'd been looking at for years without recognition, was Bob Sullivan. "You're the hero in that picture," she whispered, pointing to the frame near the coffee station. "The one who saved those civilians in Kandahar." The entire cafe fell silent as the truth settled over everyone present. Bob Sullivan wasn't just any veteran. He was a Bronze Star recipient who had risked his life to save Afghan families caught in crossfire. Because the truth about Bob Sullivan was even more incredible than anyone could have imagined. David waited until Steele's motorcycle disappeared down the street before joining his father at the small table near the window. Bob looked at his son's new rank insignia and smiled with obvious pride. They talked quietly about the promotion, about family, and about the importance of standing up for what's right. The other soldiers remained respectfully distant, giving father and son their privacy while ensuring that everyone in the cafe understood that Master Sergeant Bob Sullivan was under their protection. Mrs. O'Connor refused to let either Bob or David pay for their meal. She said it was the least she could do for someone who'd served his country with such honor. Several other customers approached Bob's table to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Sarah, the young waitress who had served Bob coffee every Tuesday for 6 years, finally understood why he always left such generous tips. Her own father had served in Vietnam and struggled with PTSD after coming home. She recognized the quiet strength that comes from carrying invisible wounds with dignity. Tom, a local businessman who had watched the entire confrontation unfold, felt ashamed that he hadn't stood up for Bob when Steele was being aggressive. He approached the table and apologized for his cowardice, but Bob just shook his hand and told him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is know when not to fight. The bronze star pin on Bob's jacket, the one that Steele had dismissed as meaningless, represented an action in Kandahar where Bob had repeatedly run into enemy fire to evacuate wounded Afghan civilians, including 3 children. The medal citation, which Bob had never shared with anyone except David, described 15 minutes of sustained courage under fire that saved 11 lives. Word of the incident began spreading through the small town before David and his soldiers had even left the cafe. But the story wasn't about a confrontation or a conflict. It was about recognition, respect, and the quiet heroes who walk among us every day. The 12 soldiers who had accompanied David weren't just showing support for a fellow veteran. They were demonstrating the military principle that you never leave a soldier behind, even years after the uniform comes off. Before leaving, David made it clear to Mrs. O'Connor and the remaining customers that his father's service to the country had earned him the right to enjoy his Tuesday morning coffee in peace. He also mentioned that the recruiting station would be keeping a closer eye on the cafe just to make sure everyone understood the message. The Devil's Riders packed up and left town that same afternoon, finding new territory where they hoped to avoid any more encounters with military families. Steel later sent Bob a handwritten letter of apology, explaining that he'd learned something important about real strength and dignity. What happened next would restore everyone's faith in humanity and justice. 2 weeks later, Bob received a letter from the mayor declaring him an honorary citizen of the year. The local newspaper ran a story about the incident, focusing not on the confrontation, but on the respect that the community owed to its veterans. David started joining his father for coffee at O'Connor's every Tuesday morning, a tradition that brought them closer together and gave them time to share stories about their military experiences. The corner booth became known around town as the Veterans Table, and other former service members began stopping by to pay their respects. Bob's reading glasses, which had been knocked to the floor during the confrontation, were replaced by a local optometrist who refused payment. The new frames were stronger than the old ones, and Bob joked that maybe sometimes you had to lose something before you could see clearly again. Mrs. O'Connor had the Afghanistan photo professionally reframed and moved it to a place of honor near the Veterans Table. She added a small plaque explaining that the young sergeant in the picture was Bob Sullivan, a regular customer and neighborhood hero. The photo became a source of pride for the entire community. Sarah, the waitress, started a tradition of offering free coffee to any customer wearing military insignia or veteran identification. The policy was enthusiastically supported by Mrs. O'Connor and quickly adopted by other businesses in town. Tom, the businessman who had felt ashamed of his inaction, organized a monthly Veterans Appreciation Breakfast at the Café. The events brought together military families from across the region and raised money for local veteran support services. The incident reminded everyone in town that heroism doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It lives on in the quiet dignity of people who continue to serve their communities long after their military careers are over. Real strength isn't about intimidation or violence. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're outnumbered, even when you're afraid, even when no one expects you to fight back. Stories like this prove that heroes live everywhere. Tell us where you're watching from. What city, state, or country? We want to honor the veterans in your community, too. Sometimes the most powerful weapon a veteran possesses isn't training or experience. It's the respect they've earned through a lifetime of service and sacrifice. Bob Sullivan had spent 30 years defending his country's freedom, including the freedom for people like Steel to ride motorcycles and speak their minds. But freedom comes with responsibility. The responsibility to treat others with dignity, to respect those who have served, and to understand that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. The Veterans Table at O'Connor's Café continues to this day, a reminder that every community has heroes walking among them. Some wear uniforms, others wear bronze star pins so small you might miss them. But they all share the same quiet dignity that can never be defeated. Thank you to everyone who shared where they're watching from. Your comments prove that respect for our veterans spans every corner of the globe. Stories like Bob and David Sullivan's remind us that real strength isn't about intimidation or violence. It's about the quiet dignity earned through a lifetime of service. Until next time, remember, true dignity can never be defeated. This moment would be remembered for generations as proof that dignity always prevails.